All right, welcome back to part two of my lecture on bonds payable. Where we left off on the last lecture was we were talking about journal entries, and we had gotten through the journal entry to record the issuance of the bond or the initial part of the loan. And now we are going to move on to the next phase of the loan, which is the journal entries we record while we're borrowing the money, so during the bond period. So what that looks like is this. As you recall, the issuance was here when we first received the loan, and now we're in this phase where we're actually borrowing. And as you can see, what happens during that phase is that we have to pay interest on the money that we are borrowing throughout the life of the loan. All right, so again, this is all the same information. Nothing's changed. On January 1st, 2015, Wells Corporation issues $1 million of 6% 5-year bonds payable, and interest is payable semi-annually June 30th and December 31st. Record the first interest payment on June 30th, 2015. So this is where we're going to use our interest formula. And again, this is the same interest formula that we learned in Chapter 9, because this is the general interest formula that is used for interest all the time. So in this class, in Accounting 1B, in your finance class, and in your real life, you're going to be using this same interest formula, which is principal times rate times time. Okay, and as we discussed, principal is the amount of money that you're borrowing for that period of time. Rate, of course, is the interest rate stated on the loan agreement. And then because the interest rate is always stated on an annual basis, we have to convert that annual interest rate sometimes to a different amount if we're not talking about an annual period of time. So time really means the portion of a year. How do we convert this annual rate to whatever portion of a year we're looking at? Now, in this case, the portion of the year we're looking at is a 6-month period, right? Because we borrowed the money on January 1st, and now it's June 30th, and we have to make that first interest payment. Okay, so we're borrowing the money at this point in time. As of June 30th, we're borrowing the money for half a year. So our portion of the year is going to be 1/2. So this is what our formula is going to look like when we fill in the numbers. We have interest being equal to $1 million is the principal, right here. That's the total amount that we're borrowing. 6% is the interest rate as stated on the contract or on the bond certificate. But we're paying at this point interest only through June 30th. So we have to convert this annual rate to the rate for a half a year. So we're going to multiply it by half. And when you do the math on that, you end up with $30,000. So the interest that we're going to be paying is $30,000. So your formula to record that interest your journal entry to record the interest is on June 30th. That's our date. That's when we're going to pay it, because that's when it's due according to the contract. And we record interest expense for that period of time, because that is our cost of borrowing money for that first 6 months of 2015. And we're going to credit cash because we're paying all of our bondholders with cash. So our cash is going down, so it's a credit. Okay. Now it's time to record our second interest payment on December 31st, 2015. Now, if you look at our timeline, we've already paid the interest through June 30th. So now, on December 31st, the period of interest that we're covering is this 6 months, really from June 30th to December 31st. So we're saying, okay, look, now we've borrowed the money for an additional 6 months, so we need to record the interest related to that. All right, so when you plug the numbers into this formula for the second interest payment, this probably looks familiar. The same formula, interest equals principal times rate times time. Our principal is the $1 million because we're still borrowing that full $1 million during that period of time. Our rate is 6%, right? It's still that stated interest rate that hasn't changed. And our period of time is still half a year. But this time it's the second half of the year, the period from June 30th to December 31st. So as you can see, when you do the math on that, interest again comes out to $30,000. It really hasn't changed. So when you record your journal entry for that second interest payment, oops, I just saw an error on my slides. Sorry, let me fix that real quick. Now our entry is dated December 31st, 15. That's when we're paying our second interest payment. But the journal entry itself is exactly the same. We're going to debit interest expense showing the cost of borrowing money for the second half of the year, which is $30,000. And we're going to credit cash to show that our cash is going down because we're paying the cash to all of our bondholders as a thank you for letting us borrow your money for this period of time. Okay. Now, as you can see the pattern go, we're going to continue to record that same journal entry every 6 months for the entire period of the bond. Okay, that's kind of the easy thing is you have to calculate it once and then you just record the same entry and make the same interest payment every 6 months. Okay, but now we're getting to the end of our bond, so we need to record the journal entry of how we record at the end when we have to pay the principal as well as the interest, the last interest payment. So what happens then is this. It says on January, same information, but then it says record the retirement of the bond. And we use that term retirement when we talk about bonds or long-term debt. And if you think about it, if you think about the word retirement, right? Retirement is what you do when you've worked your entire life and then you get old and tired and you're like, I'm not going to work anymore, I'm retiring. Well, that's kind of what's happening to our bond, right? Our bond has been going, we've been, borrowing money, making these interest payments for year after year after year after year, and now we're tired, we're ready to retire that bond, or in other words, repay it. So we want to record the retirement or the repayment of the bond, and you also need to consider the last interest payment that needs to be made because the bond is a 5-year bond from January 1st, so it ends on December 31st. Well, there's also an interest payment that's due December 31st, so you have to consider both if it asks for that in the question. So you have to read the homework questions carefully and make sure if they want you to include the last interest payment or not. So in our example here, we are going to consider that last interest payment. So what it looks like is this, okay? Wells Corporation is now going to pay the bondholders back the full principal amount. So they're repaying the loan, which is the $1 million. And in exchange, this promise of the bond payable goes away, right? We've repaid it. We no longer owe you this money anymore. So when you record it in your journal entry, it looks like this, okay? December 31st, 19, that's 5 years from the date of issuance from January 1st, 2015. And our bond payable liability account, we're going to debit it to show that the liability is going down. The liability is going away for $1 million. We're going to record that last interest payment for the last 6 months of the bond period of $30,000 because like I said, you only really need to calculate it once and it's going to be the same amount every 6 months. And so the total amount of cash that we're paying is $1,030,000, which includes the principal of the bond of $1,000,000 plus that last interest payment of $30,000. So, just to recap everything that you hopefully learned from this lecture series, we learned about bonds payable, what they are in general, and the characteristics of a bond. And we learned about the journal entries to record the issuance, to record the interest payments while we're borrowing the money, and to record the repayment or retirement of the bond at maturity. And hopefully this now you have a good understanding of the basics of bonds so that when we're in class we can go over the more complex topic of time value of money. So if you have any other questions or if anything is unclear, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in class on Tuesday.